another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Now, if you want to start a fight in the software development world, ask a group of developers what Agile means. And this episode has been kind of a long time coming. If you've listened to the podcast for long enough, we've touched on this on a couple different instances a while back, and I mentioned that it would be worth doing an entire episode on. I never got around to it, but now we, I guess, finally decided to get around to it. So basically in this episode, I kind of want to just talk about the different components of what kind of makes up Agile, as well as how multiple teams can do it differently, and kind of some of my own experiences and how some function better than others. So that's coming up in this episode. But before we get into that, let's start with our trivia question for the week. So the IBM Simon was a cell phone built on the x86 platform and featured a 4.5-inch resistive touch display and ran a MS-DOS compatible operating system. But what year was it released? And a bit of a hint, the fact that it ran a MS-DOS compatible operating system might give you a little bit of a hint there. So that is your trivia question for the week. Now, before we get into our cybersecurity tip, I did want to break some very important news that, at least as of the recording of this podcast, there has been no new Cisco 10 out of 10 CVEs this week. So we got to give it up for Cisco. They had a streak there where they had 3 in 2 weeks. So kind of on a bit of a hot streak there with perfect 10s. Of course, not the perfect 10s that you want to be scoring, but they were scoring them nonetheless. But at least as far as I could tell, there were no new 10 out of 10 CVEs from Cisco this week. So way to go, Cisco. I guess things have finally maybe settled in. I guess we'll see what happens in the coming weeks. But with that, let's move into this week's cybersecurity tip. So this week's cybersecurity tip is to make sure you check what is on your screen before you share it. Now, this doesn't only apply to if you're in a meeting and you're trying to share your screen to show whatever's on there, or if you're just taking a screenshot on your phone or a screen recording on your phone. Whatever the case is, you always want to make sure you double check what's in the background of your screen share before you share it, because you might not notice it, but there are plenty of people out there that are what we call pixel peepers, and they will look for every little bit of information that they can get based on what's on your screen. So I think the rule of thumb is if you're trying to, say, share a screen for a presentation, either close out all your windows, have everything minimized, use a completely different desktop, however you want to operate it, but basically only have the thing that you want to be shown displayed when you're sharing, and make sure everything else is not there, basically as a full fail-safe measure to make sure you're not showing anything potentially sensitive. Because the last thing you want to have happen is, say you're doing like a screen recording for like a presentation or something, and you have your password manager open in the background. That obviously isn't something you necessarily want everyone in the world to be able to see, because that could potentially compromise some of your passwords and therefore some of your accounts. So you definitely don't want that to be showing. But also other things too, like really anything personal, like whether that's like personal messages, emails, pictures, anything like that. definitely want to make sure none of that stuff is on your screen, or if you have the ability to only record certain portions of your screen, the portions of your screen that you're recording, none of that stuff is visible. And again, the same thing goes for if you're on like a mobile device, like if you wanted to take a screenshot to send to a friend or something, make sure that there's nothing else in said screenshot before you send it along. And the other thing too to note is depending on the platform you're using, if you take a screenshot of your entire screen and then crop it down, there is a potential that all that data is still in the image that you cropped. So someone could theoretically uncrop the image and get the entire screen back and potentially whatever you tried to crop out. So just kind of as a little bit of a heads up. So the safe thing to do is just to make sure that nothing sensitive or personal is on the screen whatsoever whenever you're taking a screenshot, screen recording, or just generally sharing your screen. And that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. So, moving things right along, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So, this week there was a couple quick updates that I have to discuss for the Pokemon game that I am working on. So, one thing that it occurred to me over the past week was I didn't have any mechanism in place to actually validate the save data coming into the game when it loads. And this is a hypocritical mistake for sure, because I constantly preach how you should always validate user input, which, in fairness, the game theoretically would be the only one generating save data, so theoretically the data should always be valid. But again, this is not a perfect world that we live in, and it is very easy for someone to open up a file on their file system, make modifications to it, and then you try to load the game back up and things don't work. So it occurred to me that there were no real checks or safeguards in place for if the data that was trying to be loaded into the game was malformed in some way. And I think I kind of knew this was the case before, but I kind of just worked around it by always making sure the data that I was loading in was actually formatted properly. So yeah, obviously not the best solution there. So basically, I tried to set out this week to try to resolve that issue, to try to ensure that if the data is corrupted or potentially malicious in some fashion, that the game won't crash. So I did got a quick fix implemented for that. So now, if the data is unable to be loaded in by the game, it will just crash and return false and basically say, nope, we weren't able to load this data in which case, probably just end up setting either the game data to nothing, basically just like a fresh new game file. Or maybe like throw some error message, saying that your game is corrupted, and haven't really decided what to do with that return. Like if it does fail to load in the save data, probably the easiest solution, of course, would just be to pretend like no save exists and just kind of go on your merry way. But I think there would at least need to be some sort of check in place to basically see, one, if save data actually exists, and if it does and it fails to load it in, then something's probably wrong with the data itself, and just kind of notify the user that, hey, we were unable to load in your save data, it's probably corrupted. Now, currently, as it exists right now, there are zero tools to actually fix a corrupted save file, partly because I haven't written the tools to do it. Not sure if I will write tools to do it, but I guess we'll kind of see once this development kind of gets further along and there's a lot more things that go into a save file. It might be advantageous to have some sort of basic editor in place to be able to easily manipulate save data for testing purposes. So it might come along at some point, but at least as of right now, one does not exist. So that was one thing that I worked on. The other thing I worked on was I touched on, I think it was last week, about getting the having the ability to swap items in your bag. So I mentioned that last week the back end portion of the code was there, but there wasn't anything implemented yet in the GUI. So I got the basic core functionality of that working in the GUI. It's still not perfect. It still doesn't show any kind of indicator of which item you selected to be swapped. So you basically kind of just have to remember. But I did at least validate and verify that it does actually swap the items in the places in the bag correctly, like it's supposed to. The only issue, like I said, is there's no way to indicate which item is currently selected to be swapped. So that's kind of the next item on the to-do list. But definitely progress being made for sure. Now it is very slow progress for sure. Like I've said over the past few weeks, been very busy. But that's kind of the point, right? The one nice thing about kind of taking this slow is I've heard various like indie game developers talk about this before, and especially ones that do it as a side hobby. It's not like their main job; it's just something they do on the side. The thing that they always try to make sure about is that developing their game never feels like a job or feels like a chore, and is always something that's fun. And I think the fact that, um, which is, I guess, one benefit of being very slow with updates on it, is because I'm not like always, on the grind all the time. Every single second of free time I have, I'm devoting to this. The chance for getting burnt out by it is significantly reduced because the amount I'm working on it is also significantly reduced. Of course, the downside for that is not as much progress gets made. But on the bright side, basically every time that I jump back into the code and start working on something else, it's just an absolute blast just a pleasure to do um, because that's kind of what it is. It's kind of like a treat. It's something that I just do for fun. It doesn't feel like a chore or anything like that. So yes, the updates have been quite slow and insignificant, if you ask me, over the past few months. But with that being said, there still are updates being made. I don't have any. While it has not necessarily has been like on the front burner, it's been kind of pushed to the back burner. It is something I'm still planning and wanting to work on. It's just other things in life happen to get in the way sometimes, and you kind of have to figure out your priorities. And a hobby coding project usually doesn't win that battle in most cases. But like I said, work's still being done on it, and I'm still very much enjoying the process. So that was what I kind of got up to this week. Now I wanted to talk about Agile for the remainder of this episode. So, when it comes to Agile, like I said at the beginning of the episode, if you want to get some software developers to fight one another, asking them what Agile means is probably a great way to do it. Because in my experience as working in software professionally for the past, I don't know how many years now, like probably five, maybe going on six. I've been on different teams and different styles of how they implement Agile. And it's very interesting to see the different approaches that teams make to what should theoretically be the exact same development style. So I've been a part of teams that kind of really aren't even following Agile. They're just kind of maybe following the general idea of it. And then I've been on other teams that are following it so down to the letter that it's basically not even Agile anymore. So that's been kind of funny. So I guess to kind of explain a little bit of what I mean by this, on the one hand, I've had teams that say, like, yeah, they're technically quote unquote agile, but the evangelists of Agile would say, no, that team is absolutely not Agile because they don't do X, Y, and Z. But then on the other side, I've been on teams that try so dang hard to be Agile and be like, we have to follow all of these principles and all of these methodologies and do everything by the book. And at that point, it's like, like, are you even really doing it at that point? Because I guess it kind of gets to the point of going back to that old phrase of whether it's like the spirit of the law versus the letter of the law type of a thing. Um, so like if you're doing like everything and following the process to a T, it kind of sounds like a wee bit hypocritical to me if you're like if you're not doing it exactly like it says, you're not agile because at least in my opinion, kind of the point of being agile is the whole idea of being flexible and being able to handle things when they happen to come up that you're not expecting. Because that's one of the big differences between it and its predecessor, which was the waterfall development life cycle. So if you're unfamiliar with how waterfall worked, Waterfall was basically this idea where you basically plan everything out in the beginning and then you go through like a linear life cycle of the application until it's done and you ship it. The whole point of Agile was to basically kind of not necessarily be the opposite, but have basically this idea of release like more often, like smaller releases more often was kind of the big idea. And when we've kind of seen that over the years, especially in how operating systems have been developed, right? Because if you think, I mean, I guess keeping Mac OS aside for a second, because Mac OS has basically had a new operating system every year. But if you think back to like Windows, for instance, like Windows was every what was it like they were on some kind of life cycle where it was like every like 5 years or so they would come out with a new big release. Then like in between there, you'd have your security updates and maybe some feature updates and whatnot. But you had your major releases like staggered out like over the years, and these were planned well in advance. That is kind of an example of like a waterfall, excuse me, style of development, where nowadays if you look at Windows 10, Windows 11, yes, technically they're new operating systems, but if you actually look under their hood, they're basically the same thing. And every like I think they have the major feature release like every year they kind of have a big feature release that they're kind of building up to, so they kind of turned into an Apple-esque type thing. But the point is, we're kind of seeing, and especially with the whole subscription thing, which we can do an entire episode, and we've talked about subscriptions before. Personally, I don't like them at all. But the thing with subscriptions is it kind of defeats the purpose of having major releases. Because if you're having a subscription model that everyone is just paying into constantly, there's really no incentive for you to come out with a big release, because it's not like you're going to be getting any additional money for it. Now, sure, you can advertise new features and whatnot, but it's not like how it was in the olden days, when you would release a new version and you had to convince your customer base to pay for the new version rather than continuing to use the old one. But subscriptions kind of did away with all that. But if you're not using Waterfall, it doesn't really matter because you're just kind of constantly going, iterating, developing, pushing releases, and that kind of thing. So it's not really a big deal. Waterfall, on the other hand, obviously it's a bigger deal because you have to put all this planning into it ahead of time. You have this very linear life cycle of the software development, and then you kind of push it out. Kind of the purpose of Agile was to basically get constant feedback from your customer base to identify potential issues, fix them, and get patches and fixes out a lot quicker, and be more flexible rather than using the term agile, being more flexible to be able to address things like change, address things like issues and bugs as they come up, rather than being on this strict linear cycle. Because the thing of it is if you're writing a piece of software and you have big plans for where you want it to go, but you have a massive vulnerability pop up in your software, if you're doing a very linear development approach, that kind of throws off your entire schedule because you have to devote time to address the critical vulnerability, get it patched, pushed out the door before you can go back onto your schedule. And at that point, I don't know how long it took you to patch the vulnerability, but it was not a insignificant amount of time. So you did have to spend time on it, in which case that basically threw off your schedule for waterfall purposes. But the point of Agile was to basically like it doesn't matter if we have something prop up because the idea of Agile is to basically have a backlog that you can basically pull items off of like as you complete tasks. Now, of course, you have your things like sprint planning where you kind of identify tasks that you want to complete in a given sprint, which typically sprints are anywhere between like 2 to 4 weeks. It kind of depends on the team. 2 weeks is definitely probably the most common one, but it doesn't have to be. Again, it's very team based, like however your team wants to do it, what works well for you. But the thing of having the backlog is, and planning for your sprint, that's basically what you want to have happen and what you want to accomplish. But if you don't accomplish everything you put on your board for your sprint, that's not necessarily a bad thing depending on what happened during the sprint, right? Like, for instance, we talked about having a critical vulnerability come up. If you have like a critical vulnerability prop up in your software, yeah, that's going to take precedent over any other feature that you were working on. Major bugs that impact customers is going to take, priority over, a new feature you're working on. So the point of the whole agile board and whatnot is a way to track your team's velocity, as they call it. And basically that's a fancy way of saying how much work are we actually getting done in a set amount of time. Now, the whole point system in agile is like the show, like I don't remember the exact title, but like the numbers don't, the points don't matter show, because the points really don't matter because so it basically goes from like a 1 to, I think that it can vary, but it goes from like 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and it kind of like scales in that way. So generally speaking, the idea is a 1 is something that anyone should be able to basically knock out in maybe like an hour or two. And then like a 5 is kind of something that maybe it'll take you a few days to a week. And depending on the team, like different numbers mean different things. But the point is that if you're gelled enough as a team, you have a general sense of, based on the task description, you can kind of identify how that should be scored and kind of assign it a point value. So the goal of your agile sprints is not to complete every single task on your board per se, but to be able to maintain the same velocity that your team has been maintaining over the past however many sprints, or even increasing it. And what we mean by that is just how many points you tick off the board and how many things you accomplish. So if there is an emergent critical vulnerability that pops up, you create a new item for it in your backlog, you add it to someone's task list, they complete that. And then that's points completed for the sprint. And yeah, they didn't complete this other task that they said that they were going to during the sprint, but they completed this critical vulnerability patch, which basically had the same amount of points. So it kind of offsets and you still maintained your velocity. So that's kind of a general idea of kind of how it works and how Agile can be flexible in that way and how you can kind of track the progress of the teams. So the one thing also with Agile versus Waterfall is Waterfall was kind of known for its very long development cycles because, like I kind of said, it was basically the feature release, right? Like if you're working for, say, Adobe, like each new, so you could think of it in a way as each new major release cycle of Adobe was kind of like a waterfall cycle, which obviously that doesn't really fly in Agile. Obviously, Agile's more of like the every couple weeks or so we're pushing out some kind of update or some kind of feature, not necessarily feature release, but we're pushing bug fixes, we're pushing maybe small features, things like that. Um, So agile is definitely more of an iterative approach versus waterfall is definitely a more linear approach. And agile definitely kind of was the, I guess, the building blocks you could say of the idea of continuous improvement, like the whole CI/CD thing. Of course, CI/CD didn't really exist yet, but the idea was you continuously improve, you continuously develop on the project and iterate on it as you push out new features, as you get feedback and metrics from your users, you can make tweaks and prioritize things accordingly, based on how they're using your software versus some arbitrary plan that you came up with, 2 months ago, a year ago, or however long ago you started down this process. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview. So, one thing I kind of wanted to get into was some of, I guess, the myths of Agile. So, one of them is people tend to think that Agile has no documentation. Now, the reason why people kind of tend to think this is it's like, oh, yeah, well, all you're doing is just kind of jumping into sprints and you're writing and cranking out as much code as possible to keep up your velocity and yada, yada, yada. But there's a difference between creating absolutely no documentation versus um, having self-documented stuff, and there's also kind of this debate between over documenting things versus under documenting things. Now, over documenting would be like, you have this massive requirements document that, let's be honest, no one's going to read anyway. You have a massive design document that documents how every little bit of the system is going to work together, and these documents are probably, depending on the complexity of your system, potentially hundreds, if not thousands, of pages long. And let's be real, no one's going to read that. At least no one's going to read the entirety of it. So you could potentially argue that that's over documenting. Now, under documenting would be you have absolutely no documentation about how your system actually works. And basically, the only way to see how it does work is actually reading through the code and trying to trace through the spaghetti to understand how everything works together. So, I am personally a big fan of self-documenting things. So, when I'm talking about self-documenting things, I'm talking about things like JavaDoc and Doxygen type documentation, or things, or the other one, Doxy, I think is the Swift version. Basically, ways that you can write comments in your code, and there are tools that exist that will basically auto generate documentation for your code base to basically describe, how the code base works, how it's structured, how the classes fit together, and all that good stuff. Because the nice thing about it too is, like, if you're using something like one of these tools, there's a lot of really good like IDE support, so like integrated development environment support for these tools. So, like, you can say, hover over a function name or right click on it or something, and you can either jump directly to the function, which doesn't matter if you have like the documentation there or not in that case. But like if you hover over it, sometimes in certain IDEs you'll get kind of like a little pop-up window that'll basically give the function overview, and basically whatever documentation you wrote for that function, like function parameters, what it does, what it returns, that kind of a thing. It'll display that information for you so you can kind of get an understanding of what this function's actually doing, so you don't necessarily have to jump to the code, parse it, figure out what it's doing in order to understand if that's the function you want to do. Now, the I guess the caveat to that is you have to make sure your documentation's up to date, right? Like if you change a function or you add another parameter or you change the return value or something like that, you need to make sure that you're actually updating the documentation for the function, which, let's be honest, we've all made the mistake of not updating the documentation for a function declaration, or we've done the copy and paste mistake where it was basically a very similar function, so we copied the documentation from the other one and pasted it for the new one and forgot to change the names and all that good stuff. We've all been there. Um, But the beauty of self-documenting things is it basically does a lot of the hard work for you. You don't have to worry about taking the time to go write documentation for your code base that you're already writing. As you're writing the code yourself and self-documenting it, all that will then be compiled, and a documentation package will basically be produced for you. So the idea that there is no documentation in Agile is definitely a myth. It is, at least if you're practicing good code practices anyway. And that kind of rolls into the next myth, that Agile has no planning. And it's understandable how you can get that understanding about Agile, because you hear this idea of being flexible and being able to adapt to potential unseen for circumstances and things like that. So there's really no planning involved. But that's not really the case, because depending on whatever your cadence is for your team, you're going to have some sort of planning meeting where you basically try to identify and prioritize, what items you want to accomplish during the given sprint. So there definitely is planning involved. And then there's also things like, when new feature requests or new bugs pop up, adding those to the backlog, and then those get prioritized and added to sprints and things like that. So there definitely is planning involved. And then there's also, so that's like, your sprint planning. But then you also kind of have, just because Agile is kind of more focused on these shorter increments, that doesn't necessarily mean there aren't, larger scale releases. Because we've seen, companies like, we talked about Windows with their yearly release for their feature updates. There are still instances where feature updates don't necessarily come every couple weeks. Sometimes they come every quarter, or they come every couple months or so. So you can build towards, larger, bigger releases with Agile, but again, that does kind of take some planning involved, and that kind of comes in how you prioritize your sprints, and kind of and prioritize your backlog. The other thing is the whole idea of daily stand-ups. Now, daily stand-ups are interesting because teams do them differently depending on the team, and each team kind of has a different understanding of what a I guess stand-up should be. um I've been on teams where the stand-up was maybe 5-10 minutes, depending on how big the team is and how many people actually showed up. And I've had other stand-ups that have gone on for an hour and a half. uh Not really a stand-up, if you ask me. But so it very much depends on the team and kind of what things come up during the stand-up. But I think, so one of the point of a stand up should basically be to be a quick status update. It should be, what have you accomplished since the last stand up? What are you currently working on, and are you blocked on anything that you need help with? And that should be all you talk about, and you basically just kind of go around the horn. Now, the kind of, I guess, pitfall that people tend to fall in, at least in my experience, is they'll kind of talk about, it's usually not what they already accomplished, because that's kind of been there, done that. But like, for what they're planning to work on or what they're stuck on, can sometimes derail the entire stand up. Because what'll happen is, we're developers. We all want to fix this problem. We want to find the solution. So oftentimes what'll happen is, someone will be like, yeah, so I'm blocked on, X, Y, and Z. And then everyone will basically try to jump in and try to solve it right there in the stand up, which is not the point for the stand up. Now, what you could do is, you could, anyone that's blocked on something and it warrants more discussion, you can basically like parking lot it, or basically save it for the end of the meeting. And then if there's time at the end, you can kind of come back to it and kind of talk about it for a little bit, before everyone goes and continues working. So those are kind of some of the things that I've noticed, as far as like the stand up goes. And then I guess, the how it kind of works in general. And there's this idea that Agile can work everywhere and anywhere, and everyone should use it. And if you're not using it, you're behind the times, which is a very interesting take, because the thing of it is it's like any methodology for doing something. It's not the best and it's not the worst. Depending on what your use case is, it might be fantastic, or it might be terrible. Like for instance, if you are a very small team and it's maybe just you, like if especially a personal project, Agile obviously doesn't make much sense. Now, can you use it? Absolutely, you can. Now, your stand ups and retrospectives and things like that are probably going to be pretty boring since you're just going to be talking to yourself. But you still could, do things like prioritize and set goals for where you want to be in like the next 2 weeks or something like that. So you can still kind of sort of make do. But that is, I guess, one of the beauties of Agile, if you're kind of thinking of it in that way, is you're just being flexible and willing to adapt to change, and you're not like being super stingent on we have to do it this way and follow these principles and have these meetings and do X, Y, and Z. And because that's where you kind of fall into the trap of, are you actually being agile anymore? Because it's kind of, if you're so dedicated to the thing and the thing somehow doesn't go as you expect it, and things kind of start to, and you might think things are falling apart, right? Because if you think about it, the point of being agile was being able to adapt and being able to iterate quickly. But if your whole point of being quote unquote agile is following a process and a methodology of how to do things, and if you're not doing those things exactly to the letter, then you're not agile. I think you're kind of missing the forest for the trees a little bit. Um, but then we kind of get into this other interesting thing with agile, where you get into this idea of like certifications and coaching, and I can't tell you how many like YouTube videos there are out there of, basically people workshopping trainings for people on how to be agile. Like there is an entire industry out there teaching people how to do agile software development. Like it's kind of crazy that we need to have all this, certification and training and all this stuff just for a way to think about how to develop software. Like to me, it's kind of wild and kind of bonkers. Although, maybe that's just, me being blind to the fact that, I'm kind of been in this world for a while now. So it just makes sense to me. But the idea of having to, certify people like Scrum Masters or having some kind of Agile certification just kind of boggles the mind, at least to me. Like if I were, say, a interviewing a candidate and I saw that, they put on their resume that they're agile certified or they're a certified scrum master, I would just be like, okay, uh cool, I guess. Not sure why you put that on there, but all right, I guess. It's kind of like, I mean, I guess on the one hand, I am a very, I'm not, as you well know, if you've listened to the podcast for long enough, I'm not the biggest fan of education in the sense that having a piece of paper saying that you know something actually means you know something. Now, granted, certifications are a bit different. I will give you that. Because certifications are generally more niche in topic. Like, for instance, you can get certifications specifically on networking. You can get certifications on cybersecurity. You can get certifications on how to use various cloud providers. I mean, there's a bunch of different certifications that can demonstrate that you know what you know. And the other benefit to certifications too is there's generally kind of a known and agreed upon curriculum for how to get said certification, so you can kind of at least have a general understanding of what the person actually knows is if they have one of them. But I don't know. I personally, if you're thinking about trying to get yourself a certification in something related to Agile, I would just ask why. Like, what? I'm not entirely sure what the value add there is per se, because at the end of the day, it's just like a way of doing business. I mean, I I guess if you have no idea how Agile works and you want to get a certification just to help your understanding, that's one thing. But if you're kind of already in the world of using it, I don't necessarily see the need to actually go out and get one, because the big difference is there's a difference between the actual practical usage of Agile versus the academic, um, I guess, experience of it, right? Like we talked about, what I've found anyway is those who don't necessarily aren't necessarily experienced with using Agile in like a day-to-day sense, like actually using it for their development process, and have gone through some kind of, I don't know if you necessarily want to call it a boot camp, but some kind of training related to it specifically. At least in my experience, those tend to be the people that are like, we have to be doing this by the book. The Agile methodology says we need to do this, 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 and this, and we need to do these things in order to be Agile. That's generally been my experience. I don't know, maybe you out there have different experiences. If you do, you can leave a comment below if you're on YouTube, or you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com, link in the show notes. But yeah, my experience is those who have been in it for a while, like just developers, they have I guess a lot more laissez-faire type approach to Agile, where they're, they'll probably like, maybe they'll have some prioritization in their backlog. They'll throw some sprints up on the board, and basically what they're doing is they're just finding tasks that need to be done and just working on them, getting them done, picking up another one, working on it, getting it done, and just finding what needs to be done and just getting it done. Now, of course, like, you're going to have someone to, kind of steer the ship, if you will, because you don't want someone working on, backlog pieces that, in all honesty, don't have much significance. Because if we're being real, if you have a critical security vulnerability in your software and you're over here, working on some, hobby feature that you want to implement, or some minor bug, that's probably not what you should be prioritizing, what you should be working on. So, of course, there is going to have to be someone steering the ship. And of course, if the higher ups in your organization want you to kind of go a certain direction or go a certain way, then that's obviously going to drive, what you prioritize and things like that. So, like I said, there's still going to be some planning involved, but at least in my experience, some of the best teams I've been on, how they kind of implement Agile, let's just say the Agile diehards would say that they are not Agile because they're not following the process, which again, like I mentioned, I kind of view that as you're kind of missing the forest for the trees. But I guess that's just me. But that kind of gets into a different, I guess, topic, which is this idea of like culture, right? Because each software development team has a different culture, and it's really hard to explain if you haven't actually been on a software development team before. But people obviously operate differently. Like some people are very extroverted, some people want to work collaboratively, depending on the team, there might be a lot of pair programming going on. Maybe everyone's just kind of isolated their own bubbles working on things, and if they need something, they'll kind of ping someone. So, how the team actually works can be very different from team to team. And if you are specifically targeting Agile to be by the book process, it has to be this way, you're probably going to get a lot of pushback from people. Plus, depending on what people's practices are, they may or may not be more reluctant to do Agile in the first place. Like, for instance, if you have, like, let me give you an example, right? Something not coding based. Like, let's say you are making a recipe, whether you're baking something. If you've always done something a certain way and it works for you and you're really happy with the product it turns out, if someone all of a sudden one day comes in and says, you should do it this way because this way's better, and if you look at, all these other famous people, they do it this way, so it's obviously better, so you should do it that way too. you're probably going to be pretty reluctant to agree to do that because why would I do that? The way I'm doing it has been working perfectly fine for me. I like the results. Why bother? Now, is that to say that you should just completely blow off the idea of trying something new? Absolutely not, because just because something works, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best way to do things, right? Yes, a bubble sort will sort your array, but it's not necessarily the best way to sort an array. So just because something works doesn't necessarily mean it's the best. And in the same vein, it kind of applies to Agile in the reverse sense. Just because Agile works doesn't necessarily mean it's the best for your team, for your culture, and so forth. So trying to push it onto folks might not necessarily be the best way to get folks on board. So I think probably the best kind of way to go about it is you really have to understand the makeup of the team's background, and again, the point of Agile here is not to follow a specific process by the book. We have to do X, Y, and Z, otherwise we're not Agile. The point of Agile is basically that being agile or being flexible, being able to adapt, being able to continuously improve, continuing to get feedback from your customers and continuing to iterate on your design, continuing to iterate on the product that you're pushing out, and being, of course, able to shift gears and prioritize different things as they come up, right? Because again, like we touched on the vulnerability instance, if you're working on a feature, of course, a critical security vulnerability is going to take the priority there. So you kind of need to shift focus to, work on that vulnerability before you can go back to your code. And that's really the point of what Agile is: being flexible, being able to kind of pivot and focus on what is important. And maybe you're working on a feature and things are coming along good. You're almost across the finish line. But then you get some new customer reports that, the feature that you're working on isn't necessarily as big of a priority to them. They're kind of more focused on this other area. So your team kind of shifts focus to that other thing. And that's not to say you never complete that feature, because it's still in the backlog, of course, but you just kind of shift your priorities to focus on something else that the customer wants, because that's really the biggest difference between waterfall and agile. Because waterfall, you'd be like, well, we're already, into this far, we've already started working on it, we're just going to complete it, we have our deadlines of what's going to be released when, and we're just going to do it this way. And not necessarily the best when you're trying to, get, especially these days when you're always constantly getting floods of information from your user base, I guess, depending on how much telemetry you track, which, if we're being honest, if you work for a big corporation, chances are there's a decent amount of telemetry that your company tracks, that you're able to basically get an understanding of how your users are using the software, what areas need to be improved, and things like that. And that's kind of how you can prioritize your backlog and what you work on. So again, kind of the whole point of being agile, at least in my opinion, is not necessarily being rigid, structured. We have to have this process. We have to have stand-ups every single day with a retrospective every other week on a day that is not Monday or Friday. And then we have to have our sprint planning the day after retrospective or right after retrospective, and all this structure and everything. And that, in my opinion, is kind of defeating the purpose, right? The whole purpose of it is to promote flexibility within the team in order to be as productive as possible, as well as prioritizing the things that need to be prioritized. So I guess to kind of sum things up, that was a lot of rambling. I think the main problem with Agile is the idea that because there is a methodology for how to do things to be agile, that you have to follow that methodology and follow those ideas to the letter in order to be agile, rather than kind of taking the understanding of being able to be flexible, being able to continuously improve and iterate on your product, and being able to focus on what needs to be focused on, and kind of being able to adjust and be flexible in that regard. So that's kind of my thoughts on it. And that's basically what I wanted to cover for this episode. But before we go, let us return to our trivia question for the week. So this week's trivia question is: the IBM Simon was a cell phone built on the x86 platform and had a 4.5-inch resistive touch display and ran an MS-DOS compatible operating system. But what year was the IBM Simon released? And again, the hint there is that it ran a MS-DOS compatible operating system. So hopefully that should at least kind of get you in the ballpark. Now, if you said 1994, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And if you enjoyed this episode, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And also, I would be interested to hear what your guys' thoughts are on Agile, what your experience has been. So if you're on YouTube, definitely be sure to drop that down in the comments below. Or if you're on podcast, you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. Again, the link for that is down in the show notes below. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.